Welcome to Mountains Made Low, where we help you encounter the love of God and live well in the modern world. I'm Dennis Mueller.
And I'm Christine Reagan.
Today on this episode, we're going to talk about something a little different because we've talked a lot about saints and various devotions over the course of our episodes here at Mountains Made Low. And you and I have shared our favorite saints. We've discussed various spiritual disciplines that have been started by the saints and have their origin in the saints. And we've talked about even various prayers and devotions to the saints and their roles as intercessors. But today we want to delve into a particular practice. Actually, I think it's a unique practice to the Catholic Church and tradition where we venerate the relics of saints and those relics that are associated with Jesus.
We do that.
Yeah.
We're kind of known for it.
It is. It is. And it was
It's
actually...
not to say that other faiths don't. Veneration goes back to some of the Eastern traditions that really do predate Christianity.
Yeah.
But I think Catholics have their own unique expression of it.
It is. Yeah. And it was probably one of the points of contention among many of the points of contention in the Protestant Reformation.
I think it still is today. People look at the things that the church keeps and shows devotion to and venerates, and they're like, why are you doing that? Yeah. It seems like idol worship. If anything that the church does seems like idol worship, it's not, but that's the closest that I think people get to in terms of the perception.
So we wanted to kind of break open the veneration of relics and what relics are and what they are in our episode today. But
do you have any relics, Dennis?
I was just going to ask you that question.
Oh, okay. What relics do I have? So I don't personally have anything. I am hoping that one day I inherit a relic that my family has, which is a relic of the True Cross that my mom got decades ago from this old Irish nun who kind of willed it to her, which is the only way you get something like that, is if an old nun gives it to you. And of course, we're not 100% sure it's the True Cross, but it has its proper documentation and it's been verified as being authentic, and however close you can get to that, that's what it is. And I just think it's really special. And so I've told my parents, give my sister everything, right? She can have everything. She can have the house. She can have all the inheritance. Please, I just want this one relic. They have two things I want. They have the relic of the True Cross, and then they have a beautiful picture that a family friend painted of the crucifixion of St. Andrew. And it is one of the most exquisite things that you'll ever see. And I put a Post-it on that, hypothetically, and I put a Post-it on that. So
give to Christine.
Yes.
Oh,
mine.
That's cool.
Mine.
That's cool. Our family, I actually had two first-class relics of St. John Neumann. Mm-hmm. You know, they're in their little reliquary, and again, they have their authentication and the documentation and everything with them. And my wife's aunt, her Aunt Trish, was dealing and battling breast cancer several years ago, and decades ago, actually, and succumbed to it. But while she was going through her treatments and dealing with this, I had given her one of those first-class relics, and she had it pinned. She had the little small reliquary that it was in pinned to her collar, of her nightgown, and she wore it all the time and kept it close to her as she was going through all those treatments. But unfortunately, when she died, no one knows what happened to the relic. It just kind of went MIA. But it was funny because her one cousin, her one daughter, she came across another first-class relic of St. John Neumann and then presented to me. And I knew it wasn't mine. She thought it was. She says, here, I have this for you. I'm like, that's not it. It was in a totally different reliquary. And they're sealed, like these things. You know that they're sealed, right? They're not, they can't be opened.
I couldn't open this True Cross one if I tried without desecrating it. Right. I don't think I could open it.
Right, yeah, because that's part of the authentication process. But yeah, so I have two. One is kept in a safe, and the other one is in a reliquary now in the home. But
it's nice to have these things close by. For a second, I almost said it's nice to have them close by.
Right.
These figures and these people who are so important to us,
yeah,
and serve as such a source of inspiration and consolation and all the things that the community of saints does for us.
And that's one of the reasons why the church, in its practice, it's no longer a practice that's done today, to my knowledge. But back in the day, especially pre-Vatican II, they would take the relics of a saint and embed them into the altars of churches.
Oh, that's right.
So, like our church here at St. Albert the Great Parish in Huntington Valley, Pennsylvania, does not have a relic in its altar, even though it predates Vatican II because our altar is wood and it's movable. And so the requirement is by the church is that any relic that is placed into an altar, the altar has to be immovable. So you're talking about those marble and granite altars that that are cemented to the marble floor. They can't be moved. And if you were to pull back the altar cloth, chances are you'd probably see maybe a 2-inch by 3-inch, 2-inch by 4-inch piece of marble that has been cut out. And underneath that would be the relic of a saint. It might be the saint of the church that it's named after, or it might be another relic of some sort, but always a first-class relic. So what is a relic?
So what is a relic? So a relic is an object, most notably part of the body or perhaps clothing, that remains as a memorial of a departed saint or Jesus himself.
Yeah.
And relics have always had an important place in Catholic spirituality.
And when we talk about those relics that are connected with Christ, we're not talking about physical parts of his body, right? Because his body's resurrected, it's not here. But we're talking about those things that are connected to him, like the cross.
Or the crown of thorns,
Right.
or the shroud. So the Council of Trent says this about relics. So this is going back to the 16th century. It said that the holy bodies of holy martyrs and of others now living with Christ, bodies that were living members of Christ and the temple of the Holy Ghost, and which are by him to be raised to eternal life and to be glorified, are to be venerated by the faithful. For through these bodies many benefits are bestowed by God on men.
And remember,
so that's a seal of approval,
right?
That we can do this.
And it's coming out from the Council of Trent, which is defending itself against some of the accusations that were being made during the Protestant Reformation.
Right. It's called the Counter-Reformation.
Right.
The church says that if the clothing or maybe a handkerchief or even the shadows of saints, we get some of those stories in the New Testament,
like St. Peter,
were instruments of healing and strength during that individual's time on earth, then we can't deny that God would work similar miracles, amazing wonders by ashes, sacred bones, and other relics of saints. I mean, I'm certainly not going to tell God what he can't do. So I think it's a beautiful practice. I think we should lean into it more and more. The word relic itself comes from a Latin word that means abandon, to leave behind. They're leaving something of themselves because we're body and soul. Mm-hmm. Their souls exist in heaven with God, but they leave something behind for us, for a connection to this connection between heaven and earth.
That's the important distinction. It's being left behind for a purpose, and that is to connect us, this world, with the other world of heaven, the connection between heaven and earth. And there's different classes.
Which is not a multiverse, as you told me last week.
That's right. It's not a multiverse. There is no such thing as a multiverse. There are several classifications of relics that I think people might be aware of, but I think it's always good to kind of explain what they are because there are differences. The first class relics are those objects that are directly associated with the life of Jesus. So like you said, the Shroud of Turin would be a first class relic. The True Cross would be a first class relic. The Crown of Thorns, even the spear that pierced Jesus' side.
Right. Who has that?
You know what? That's around somewhere.
Maybe.
I know that was a big thing during World War II. I think that was one of the things.
Were you there?
No, but I know that was one of the things that Hitler was looking for. I believe my understanding is that he was looking for it because he just had this whole magical property type thing.
Somebody watched a History Channel documentary.
Yeah. I'm just fascinated by those type of things. But the physical mortal remains of saints are also first class relics. So, like anything that belonged to or came from their body, from bone, hair fragments, and all those things. But you have some really extraordinary examples, like the tongue of St. Anthony of Padua.
Sure.
His whole body was, had decayed except his tongue because he was such a gifted and holy preacher. You have the body of St. John Newman, again, right here in Philadelphia at St. Peter the Apostle Church. His body is there for veneration in a glass altar in the lower church. You have the forearm of St. Jude the Apostle, which you and I had the opportunity to see when it was coming through the United States last year.
Yeah, I remember asking you, are you going to go see St. Jude's arm this weekend? Which was neither of us batted an eye. It was a totally normal sentence and question to pose to somebody.
Yeah. Next week we're going to go see the head of John the Baptist.
There was the veneration of the relic, and then it had the celebration of Mass. There was communal prayer. There were songs that were sung. I mean, Jesus was still the focus of the whole thing. So again, we never
Central
mean to
focus.
tiptoe into idol worship. It's veneration for holy men and women
That leads
but
us to Christ.
It leads us
That
to
leads us to
a
Christ.
greater relationship with Jesus and a greater understanding of the power that he really has.
Yeah.
He only has.
And speaking of heads, did you know that the skull of Saint Thomas Aquinas is on tour in the United States?
You know,
It's
I
making its way.
heard- I did, I heard
I don't know
about
what the
this.
schedule is, but again, I mean, his arm is somewhere else, and his head is coming here to the United States for a while.
And if this is really weirding somebody out, just stay with us. Just bear with us.
Just hang in there, right? Yeah, just hang in there because we're going to get into a little bit more of the why behind all this stuff. But as you can imagine, these first class relics would be extremely rare and limited just by design because of their nature. It's a literal piece of the body of the saint itself. Second class relics are a little bit more available, but again, they're exceedingly rare too. Not as rare as first class relics, but a second class relic would be something that the saint either possessed for personal use or was known to use on a regular basis. So their clothing, for example, would be considered a second-class relics.
It's called a contact relic because they had contact with it.
They had contact
so
with
it's
it,
not
yeah.
it's not we're having contact necessarily with their body. It's something that they had contact with.
Right. So I'll give you an example. St. Catherine Drexel here in Philadelphia, her shrine used to be at the Mother House for the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament before it closed, and now her remains, at least, have been moved to our Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Center City, Philadelphia. But when her remains were interred at the Mother House in Bensalem here, you could go there and they would have all this beautiful information about her life there, the Blessed Sisters, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament would have. But there was a room that had all of these beautiful second-class...
It's like a little museum almost.
all these
Yeah.
second-class relics. And second-class relics included her garment that she wore every day, her habit, her cross that she wore every day, but also the desk that she worked at every single day. She used that desk every single day, when she was there. That would have been a second-class relic. And what I really thought was so cool, it was just, I loved it when we used to bring kids on tour there, but they had this little jar and it had all of her pencil nubs. Like she would use a pencil and she would work it down to where it was almost like an inch.
Yeah.
These little nubs because she never believed in wasting anything.
Such a symbol of her poverty.
Yeah. So all of these little pencil nubs that she used on a daily basis to write her notes and to kind of record her thoughts, her prayers, and other missives for the sister, they're second-class relics.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a second-class relic. So you can understand why they would be rare and hard to get a hold of. Right. Hey, I got the desk of St. Catherine Drexel in my living room now. Right. It's not going to happen. Those things are generally... Second-class relics are most often found in the place where the saint lived.
The congregation
resided.
owns it.
The congregation
Yeah.
generally owns it.
They hold on to those things.
The most common relic that I think most people are familiar with are what's known as third-class relics. And those third-class relics are third class because it's generally a piece of cloth, generally found in a prayer card, and that cloth was either touched to a first or a second-class relic and blessed. So it's not something that has a direct affiliation with the saint during their life, either through their personal contact or being a part of them. But it's generally, again, it's just a simple cloth of some sort that's been touched to one of those two relics and blessed and is used for veneration. You most often find those in prayer cards. You'll have the prayer cards that'll be laminated, and then down in the bottom corner there'll be this little laminated cloth that's down there. Third class.
And maybe
relic.
that's confusing for people because they might think, oh, that's a cloth of maybe the habit of Catherine Drexel, something like that. It's like, no, it's been touched to it.
Yeah, and I think that's where the confusion is. Like, oh, I have a cloth of St. Catherine Drexel, and chances are you're
I'd be
not.
like, let me see it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what I would say. You can also make your own third-class relics. Say, a couple years ago, or many years ago, I think Gianna Mola's gloves were on tour. And you could go up to the gloves, and you could, if you wanted to, you could bring a handkerchief of your own or a cloth of your own, and you could touch it directly to the gloves. Oh. And you could take that with you. It's your cloth. It's your item. So you could touch to the gloves. And the gloves were not in a case at that point. They were kept in travel, but they were exposed fully for veneration and for you to touch.
I didn't know that.
And you can make your own third-class relics.
Oh, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Is that legal, do you think?
I mean, they let us do it. These were official, church organizations that I'm assuming. I remember at the St. Jude event, you could do that too. Now, it was in a reliquary,
But they
so
were
you did not
touching it
have
to the glass.
entire contact.
Yeah, it was in a reliquary, and
right.
that reliquary was in a glass case.
Right. But you were encouraged to make contact.
Right.
So I don't know that it would make a third-class relic. I wonder what the properties of all of that are. But I know that if you can physically touch something to a direct article of clothing or something, then you would. How is that any different than what the church does to produce these things for the universal church?
Yeah,
so.
I think you might be right, because again, this is just me reminiscing, and God knows where my mind has been and where it's gone and stuff. But thinking back to when we went there, I can almost hear the priest saying that exact same thing and inviting us to come up to do that. Now, whether he used third-class relic or something like that, or making relics of your own, I don't know whether he used that language, but there was that invitation to do that.
And he was telling the people to take it home, take it to your sick family members, take it to, like, as though if God wants to do this, he's going to do it.
Right.
So take it home, bring it home to your family.
But there's a wonderful history and behind the use of relics. This isn't something that's been generated by the church willy-nilly. I mean, there's a beautiful history and a tradition that goes all the way back to even Jesus himself. And then the purpose. There's a purpose for relics too.
Yeah. You might think the Council of Trent goes back pretty far, but I mean, this tradition goes back even further than that. So church history has always detailed these amazing events that took place at the tombs of martyrs for generations. And if you look in the writings of St. Ambrose and St. Augustine, they talk about not just that they had heard these things had happened, but that they witnessed these things, these amazing miracles take place at the tombs of saints. And then I think about in the Old Testament, let's go further back, when a dead man came back to life because his dead body was thrown into a grave, and in that grave were the bones of Elisha, the Old Testament prophet.
Yeah.
So he's thrown into the grave, his dead body makes contact with the bones,
Doesn't he
and
come
then
back
he
to life?
walks out of the grave.
Yeah.
He comes back to life, he walks out of the grave. So that goes back even further. But one of my favorite stories takes place in the 2nd century. So one of the earliest recorded accounts of the veneration of relics comes from St. Polycarp's death. So we're talking, he died in like 156. So that's around the time that we're talking. And he has an amazing life story. His captors, he's an old man at this point. I think he's like 86. They wanted him to recant his faith and his belief in Christ. They wanted him to swear allegiance to Caesar. And he said this as he was asked to do that, to preserve his own life. He said, "If you imagine that I will swear by Caesar, you do not know who I am. Let me tell you plainly, I am a Christian." You want the right words at the right time? There you go.
He knew what awaited him when he said those words, too.
He did, and he knew long before. He knew that he was going to have a martyr's death. He knew that he was going to be burned alive, or that they were going to try to do that. Just by virtue of his relationship to Christ, these things were made known to him. So they tried to burn him alive, but eyewitnesses say that when the fire broke out, it broke out into like an arch around him, and that he illuminated with these flames like sails on a ship in this arch form.
Is this the one where he was kind of compared to like baked bread?
He
like
was
golden bread
glowing. They said he was glowing like baked bread.
Okay.
So, which certainly speaks my language. It's my favorite food group. So, but they said it looked like he was glowing like baked bread, or he was glowing like gold in a furnace, which is just so biblical. Finally, they ended up stabbing him just to kill him, and then his blood put the fire out. These are the stories we should be telling far more often in the church than we do. But anyway, all of this brings us to the fact that his followers, they wanted his bones, so they ended up stealing them to possess them again. And they wrote this. They said, "We took up his bones, which are more valuable than precious stones and finer than refined gold, and laid them in a suitable place, where the Lord will permit us to gather ourselves together as we are able in gladness and joy, and to celebrate the birthday of his martyrdom." I mean, they just wanted to keep him close. They wanted to celebrate who he was, what he meant to them. His blood is the seed of the church. His blood was the seed of that community. Beautiful.
You know what I just learned? I just learned that not only do you have a unique understanding of the church's teachings with regards to the death sentence and the execution of dictators, but also that watching somebody being burned alive, but also watching somebody being burned alive makes you hungry. So But
I just like the idea of bread being baked all the time. Panera Bread, not a sponsor yet, but maybe
right,
one day.
maybe
Who
one
knows?
day. But relics really are sacramental in nature. The 1983 Code of Canon Law defines sacramentals as, and the definition is, sacred signs by which effects, especially spiritual effects, are signified in some imitation of the sacraments and are obtained through the intercession of the church. Okay? So what does that mean? So in essence, the purpose of sacramentals, the purpose of these relics, which are sacramentals, much like the sacraments themselves, is to help people to grow in holiness, to worship God, and to strengthen one's faith. That's why we have relics in the church. That's the purpose that they serve, to help others to grow in holiness, to lead them to love and to worship God.
They serve a purpose for us because of who they served
Yeah.
in their time on earth.
Right.
It's never about what they did. It's about who they loved and who we're drawn to just by meditating on their life, by feeling close to them physically for this moment in time. So what aren't relics? I think it's important to make some of these statements. Relics are not objects of magical power. They don't
Right.
possess any power within themselves. None of this is Catholic magic that we're talking about.
Right.
That was actually one of Martin Luther's complaints. He didn't understand this business of relics. And even saying business is not the right word to say because none of this is being sold or traded. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Right, but that was part of his thing because he really
was-
thought that it was a business.
Yeah.
That the church was into.
And perhaps the church has abused that in the past too. That has to be reckoned with. But to be magical, the relic would have to have some cause greater than itself. And that's not what the church believes or even teaches about relics.
Right, because God is always understood to be the source of the miracle, regardless of the miracle that takes place, right? I mean, the relic is merely an instrument of God's love, much like he uses us as instruments of his love when we allow ourselves to be played by him. That's all he's doing with the relic. And so sacramentals and relics really don't make, well, not really, they don't make God do anything. It's not like Aladdin and the genie. You rub the lamp, and all of a sudden, the God has to do
Right.
what you tell him to do,
Yeah.
right? Because you possess this relic. It doesn't work that way.
In Aladdin, the genie's compelled to do this. He doesn't want to have to do things. It's not like we're compelling God to work in a way that he does not desire to work.
Yeah, it's not like you're going to sit there and rub the relic and like, hey God, I got a relic. Now
Right,
you
and
got
then
to do what I'm
God's
asking
like,
you to do.
I have to grant you these
Right.
3 wishes. No, God doesn't have to do anything if he doesn't want to or if it's not going to be ultimately for our good.
Yeah.
Right, and all of that has been worked out with God long before we even entered into the equations.
Yeah.
God only works the way in which he desires to work, and that orders us towards salvation.
Right, and there's no room for superstition here at all, right?
No, not at all. He's always the source of divine power. The use of relics and their efficacy is completely dependent on God. Relics can be used on the occasion of God's miraculous power, but they're not the source of that power.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah, we have to keep that in mind.
And relics are also not objects of worship. Relics are not worshipped in the Catholic faith. And St. Jerome said this in the 4th century. He said, "We do not worship, we do not adore, for fear that we should bow down to the creature rather than the creator. But we venerate the relics of martyrs in order to better adore him whose martyrs they are."
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction, too, because I think that's one of the criticisms that the church faced, especially during the Reformation, that we were using these relics to worship and adore them.
Them, not God.
Them, not God. Going back to the 4th century, you can see that that's not the position of the church at all. And it's never been the position of the church.
There's a reason that he had to make that statement in the 4th century because people were probably falling into misunderstanding back then. And so the church has repeatedly throughout the 4th century, 16th century, and probably a million times in between said, this is why we do what we do. This is why it's good for you. But to practice it like this, not good.
Right.
Superstitious. Stay away from it.
And it's
not magic.
understandable because even today, I mean, I know people who have such devotions to a particular saint that it trumps anything that has to do with Jesus himself. You think about those people that have a very strong devotion to Padre Pio or to Saint Therese of Lisieux. They're wonderful devotions to have, but if they're not leading you to a holiness or a deeper encounter with Christ Jesus, then we kind of need to reevaluate that. If they're the go-to person all the time and that's not leading us to an encounter with Christ, then you can understand why somebody would interpret that as being abusive or even borderline adore or worship. But we don't adore. Adoration and worship is something that is reserved for God alone. The church makes that very, very clear. But what exactly is veneration? What do we mean by veneration? Because that's not a word that we use outside of church circles, right?
I think you might use it in like sporting references, the world of sports. I think people come to, let's say a team wins the Stanley Cup and then they take it on parade. And, people kind of want, I'm not saying they're not doing it, but I think there is that spirit of, I want to touch it. I want to kind of venerate
I guess
the cup
that's a good analogy. I hadn't thought of it that way.
And when tennis players win tournaments, they take the trophy, they hold it up, they kiss it, they venerate it.
They fill it with champagne and they drink from it.
My mom goes crazy about it. She hates it. She hates that they kiss this golden idol. She sees it as like an idol of some kind. Yeah. I don't see it that way. I see it as they're showing reverence and respect for all the people who came before them who also held that trophy. And you're recognizing the great tradition of tennis in history. I thought that was a really compelling. All right, let's move on.
Well, it's tennis.
Okay, but I mean, the NBA does it too. They have a trophy. What do you think about trophies? Do you think we should be giving trophies to each other? I'm cool with it.
Well, I think you should be giving trophies if trophies are deserved. But this idea that everybody gets a trophy today is,
okay. So
it annoys me beyond the pale because it reduces what you're talking about. If everybody,
you didn't really earn anything.
Right. If everybody's just getting a trophy because we want everybody to have something in hand, then yeah. But
I don't disagree with that.
That's a problem. But if it is something that is unique and something that's earned and merited and that you have to really work for like an entire season to get a Stanley Cup or, to get the Super Bowl trophy or whatever else that it might be, Wimbledon trophy, whatever. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that kind of go into that. And so I can understand the magnitude of that.
I'm just curious. If you won a trophy of that magnitude, would you venerate it and kiss it?
I don't know because I could never conceivably.
You'll never be in that situation.
Vision myself being in that situation. I mean, you're talking. I was the last guy picked for everything, when growing up. So that's never really crossed my mind.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Let's just say, would you feel as though that's a violation of your faith?
I don't know because you're asking me a hypothetical that I can't.
Of course, I'm trying to break this up a little bit. Give the listeners something to.
I don't see myself doing that, but who knows? If I put in the blood, sweat, and the tears to get to it and I got it, it might be a whole different story. Yeah. I can't picture myself doing that or desiring to do that. I mean, I might hold it up and I might be excited that I won it, and I might celebrate with everybody else the win, but I don't know if I'd be kissing and hugging and doing all that other stuff to a piece of metal.
Yeah.
I don't know, but who's
to say? It's an interesting conversation on how we show respect to the things that are most important to us and even precious to us.
But that's what veneration is really all about. It's the respect, the awe, the reverence, and even the inspiration that one has for the life of this other person.
Sure.
Right? That's what it means to venerate. So the sole purpose of relics is really to help us to connect to the history of our faith and the fullness of the church. It's us here on earth and those that are in heaven. That's the veneration that we're talking about. And what's really interesting is people say, they didn't do this. They didn't venerate. This is a Catholic practice. It's not. Go back and take a look at the story of Jesus' death and the veneration that they showed his body after death. It's beautiful when you begin to kind of connect the dots because we're told that Joseph of Arimathea pleaded with Pilate for Christ's body after he died. We see that in Mark and in John's gospel because what would have happened to his body if he didn't claim it and take possession of it? The Romans would have just discarded it. They probably just would have thrown it.
That's exactly what they wanted to do with Polycarp because they said if Polycarp's followers get his bones, it's only going to embolden them more. Right. And they didn't want that to happen.
So they would have just burned the body and just destroyed it afterwards. But he pleads to retrieve the body, and then he lays Christ in his own tomb, his own personal tomb, this tomb that he had, this new tomb, unused tomb. They didn't even bother to throw him into a used tomb, which was common practice back then. Here it is, a brand new tomb for Jesus. John's gospel reveals how Nicodemus donated over 100 pounds of spice for Jesus' burial, which, again, we're like, 100 pounds. That is an absurd amount of spice. And it's typically reserved for only the most honored dead, like kings and high priests and everything. And here they are, they're doing this for Jesus. And we also hear how the women went to visit the tomb after Passover to further anoint Christ's body with spices. even though the tomb had already been
Boy, did they get a
sealed.
surprise.
Right, yeah. So they were going. They would have had to have somebody remove the stone for them to get in there. And boy, are they surprised when it's already removed and the guards are gone and the tomb is empty. But these are all acts of veneration that are shown to the body of a man who was considered by many at the time just to be a holy man. But in the case of Jesus, the holiest man who ever lived, we know that it was certainly something that should have been afforded to him because he wasn't just a holy man, he was God incarnate. So this idea of venerating the body is not something that is foreign to us. It's not something that the church developed. The church is looking at about how we treated Jesus at the time of his death, and because of our dignity as a human person being baptized into his life, death, and resurrection, we continue to venerate the body of the deceased today, especially those holy men and women who we know are in heaven, who've been declared to be amongst the other saints in heaven.
Yeah.
So how's a relic verified? That's a good question. I think it's an interesting process.
Right, because you want to know, even with this relic of the true cross, we don't 100% know if it is exactly that instrument of Jesus's passion and death.
Yeah.
We're not 100% sure, but we're pretty sure. And so how can we be pretty sure? Well, to be honest, there can be abuses in the church when it comes to relics. We have to acknowledge that first off. That was a problem historically in the church, especially in the earlier centuries, when there were a lot of fake relics going around.
Yeah.
The church has apologized for all of this. It's been reckoned with, and it does not occur anymore. It should never have happened,
Right.
and it doesn't happen today.
And while they weren't engaged in the selling of relics so much, but there was profiteering. So because if I had the head of John the Baptist in my church and people were coming to venerate that, well, there's a little stream of income of people who are making donations and whatnot as they come to see the relic. So there was some really abusive profiteering taking
And
place.
donations, you can take donations today, but it's all about how that money is being taken up and how
Yes.
it's being used.
And what it's being used
so
for.
strictly regulated.
Yeah. To prevent this type of abuse that had occurred back in the day.
Right. Because when people hear about these things, it hurts our faith.
It does.
It hurts our perception of, unfortunately, Christ himself, who's got nothing to do with it. So how do we know that a relic today that we may want to show reverence for, that we may want to venerate, how do we know that this is legitimate or not? So relics have to be authenticated by the church. There's an entire process about this. It has to be investigated by the local bishop. It has to be determined what kind of class of relic it is. And it has to involve sometimes some scientific validation too,
Sure.
especially if we're talking about human remains. But when it comes to authentication, it's never going to mean absolute certainty. In many of these cases where we're talking about saints that have been long dead for generations and generations.
Sure.
But if the authorities within the church say officially that a relic is authentic and credible, they're relying on things that are, I think, good enough for our purposes. They're relying on human wisdom, human prudence, scientific investigation, and the church's tradition. That's enough for me. And if we're wrong, does God not honor intention? I mean, think about what we're saying about God.
That's
God's
true.
not going to be like, no, I'm not going to do what you want me to do, or I'm not going to listen to your prayer because that's not legitimate. Well, I believe that it is, and I believe in God. You don't think God's going to do something with that? You don't think that's in his nature? Come on. We have to remember who God is in all of this.
And again, if God can use me as an instrument to draw somebody else closer to him through what I say or what I do, then why couldn't God use this erroneously authenticated relic
Right.
that might not be a relic of the true cross to do the same thing?
Yeah, as I interact with it, and as I'm showing the devotion that I'm showing to the relic, especially if it's a true cross relic, I'm showing that devotion to Jesus, to God
Yes.
alone. Wouldn't he delight in that so much?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm
Again,
okay with
you
it.
have to keep the purpose of the relic in mind. A family or congregation rights can't be violated in this process
No.
either. So the church asks for the approval of families, and like that really comes into play with more modern day saints whose relatives are still alive.
Right, like Carlo Acutis.
Yeah,
Right?
or
He's going to be canonized soon.
right, or was it Gianna Molina?
Gianna Mola. I mean,
Mola,
her family's
Mola.
still alive.
Yeah,
She's got
Her
children.
daughter is still alive, and so The family has to be taken into consideration with
The
regards
church doesn't
to
just blow, like the Kool-Aid guy doesn't just blow the door open and say, that's ours because of who she is to us. No,
Right.
no, the family has to consent to all this.
right. The family owns even the Shroud of Turin that was owned by what was it? There was a
Famous Italian family.
famous there was a famous
I can't
Italian
think of it.
family. I don't know if it was the Dukes of Savoy or somebody, but they owned it for a long time before they actually passed it on to, now the Pope owns it, belongs to the Pope, whoever the Pope is.
It's one of the perks of the job.
Right, belongs to the church. The church has to work with the family with regards to any relics that they might be able to procure. I mean, if the family says no, well, then it's no.
It's a non-starter.
It's a no. It's a non-starter.
Yeah. In
Right.
any case, though, the relics can absolutely never be sold. You cannot trade them. And when they are displayed, and when we use phrases like, "Oh, they're on tour," and even if you have them,
I hate that expression.
That's terrible.
Right? Yeah.
I'm okay with it. I think it's funny, but
Right.
but you have to understand what I'm okay with it because I know what the church means when
Right.
they take relics around the world or around the country.
Right, and I'm uncomfortable with it because I know how others interpret
People
it.
don't.
Right,
I
yeah.
know. They have to be exposed and venerated in an appropriate manner. It has to be in a sacred reliquary, in a sacred space.
And that brings up an interesting question because there's many people like you and I who have first-class relics, who, for lack of a better word, own them. They belong to us, or they've been passed down from one family member to another. And so is it really permissible for the average person like you and I to be in possession of these things? And
Gosh, I hope so.
And if
'Cause I'm not giving it back.
and if it is, then what is our responsibility with regards to how we care for them and how we maintain them? Do we leave them in a sock drawer in the bedroom, or should they be on display somewhere in a proper reliquary in the home?
Yeah.
Is it okay to keep them locked away in a safe for protection and security, or do they have to be out and exposed in a sacred place? These are really good questions. But those of us who have a first-class relic, again, we probably obtained them as a gift from a church authority at some point. I don't know how my family came into possession of the St. John Newman relics. I know for certainty that one of them belonged to my grandparents, but I do not remember the story and how they obtained it. But they're passed down from generation to generation, and all of that is perfectly legal. It's perfectly moral. But just know that these types of gifts are no longer made within the church. In fact, they're prohibited now. So the church does not give out first-class relics to any individual. So if you have one, consider yourself very lucky, because the opportunity to possess one now is nil. It just does not happen. And if you're in possession of this, there's nothing wrong with you having it in your private possession. There's actually a special office in the Vatican that handles the distribution of relics throughout the entire church. And that office is called the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints. They're the same ones that work through the saint causes. When a petition is brought up for an individual to be considered for sainthood, they also control the distribution of relics. And they provide relics free of charge to churches and to institutions. And there is a formal process that a parish or that a diocese or that an institution would have to go through in order to obtain the relic, and not all the time is it granted. But it is legally impossible today for any individual to obtain a relic from Rome. It just does not happen anymore. So if you're in possession of a first-class relic, like Christine and I are, cherish it. And make sure that your family is aware of it. And I would encourage you, if you have one of these first-class relics, to make arrangements for the relic to either be passed on to a worthy heir in the family, and by that I mean somebody who will treat it with the reverence and the respect that it deserves. And if there is no such person in your family, then you should make arrangements in your will to have that relic returned to the church or church authorities after your death. That's the proper way to
Yeah, you
honor
would
it.
never want it to be left to just be treated improperly.
Yeah, or
because
just
somebody doesn't
disposed,
understand what it
because they
is,
don't understand
disposed
it.
of. Worst case scenario, desecrated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we want to take care of the things that are precious
Yeah.
in our faith life.
But this also begs another question, doesn't it?
It does.
when
What
we
is that
talk
question,
about that.
Dennis?
Well, the question is that the way the church treats relics with regards to the church's teaching with regard to disposal of ashes,
Right. And burial
the
rights, all
burial
of that.
rights,
So how are
and
these things compatible? So
yeah.
I think it's a fair question to ask. I can see many people challenging a lot of what we're saying and ask the question, how can we have multiple first class relics of saints, meaning that their body is not together? We put them all over the world, we take them on tour, but I can't put my dad's ashes in a locket and wear it. They may not understand.
How does
Or
that jive?
they might say, we have remains of saints all over the world, but I can't scatter my mom's ashes near her favorite tree, in her favorite place, near a bench that we dedicated to her. They say, how are these things not a contradiction? Why isn't it hypocritical for the church to forbid Catholics from having cremated remains scattered or set on display in a mantle in a home of a family member while it scatters the body parts of saints throughout the world? Number one, that is done for a purpose.
I think these are good
These
questions.
are, I think everything we're saying has been building to this,
Yeah.
right? Because this is such a popular practice in society when loved ones die. Okay, so number one, when we're talking about the scattering of ashes is prohibited in the church because of our belief in the resurrection of the dead.
That's right.
We believe that our bodies are going to be glorified with Christ when he comes to judge the living and the dead at the end of time. That's what we profess in the creed. The body carries tremendous dignity, and that extends beyond death. It extends into eternity. So the prohibition is to prevent the body from being treated in any kind of disrespectful manner or giving the appearance of us just discarding our bodies.
Yeah.
So there's a 2016 church document that says this about this matter. This is from the CDF, if you know what that is. The reservation of the ashes of the departed in a sacred place ensures that they're not excluded from the prayers and the remembrance of their family or the Christian community. It prevents the faithful departed from being forgotten or their remains from being shown a lack of respect, which eventually is possible, most especially once the immediate subsequent generation has passed away. You may find these remains and these ashes to be incredibly important. You may think you're venerating them in the way that the church would approve of, but what about the generation after you? What about the generation after that? Eventually, it's not going to bear the same relevance and importance to our descendants.
Yeah.
And so the church wants to make sure that nobody is discarded. Everybody is prayed for. Everybody is respected. And that's what is encouraged and asked for in a Catholic burial.
Because there's no guarantee that that locket or that ring or that other piece of jewelry that you had designed with your parents' ashes is going to remain in the family.
It could be
from
easily
generation to
lost.
it could be lost.
Yeah.
It could be sold by a descendant because they just don't realize what it is or the value of it.
Yeah. Catholics are always asked to show particular reverence for our dead and to bury our dead in a specific manner that always aligns with our belief and hope in the resurrection.
Yeah.
We're always looking to the future. And when you want to keep these ashes close by, when you want to scatter them here on earth, there's a very temporal thing going on. We want to keep them close to us. Well, everything that is here is going to pass away. So we need to entrust our beloved dead, ourselves, to God and his realm, which is eternal.
It is true that we can pray for the faithfully departed anywhere and at any time. But praying from a gravesite in a cemetery really does remind us that death is a reality that we are all going to face, but that is sacred ground, right? That ground has been consecrated, and a sacred burial took place that is a tangible reminder of our hope in the resurrection of the body. I mean, just if you were, again, paying attention to the prayers that were prayed and the rituals that were performed, it's a reminder in the hope of the resurrection of the body. Now, whereas the relics of saints are preserved and venerated in churches around the world, precisely because of our belief in and our hope of the resurrection. So we're not discarding their bodies in any way, even though their bones are being scattered, quotations, right, air quotes here, are being scattered throughout the church, so to speak. But rather, we are placing them on display for veneration in sacred places, in holy places that are dedicated to their memory and their holiness. And we're doing that for the members of the church the church living, the church militant, us, and many people who aren't even a member of the church who come by to take a look at these things for their contemplation as individuals seek their intercession before God and for their veneration. I've said this a couple of times, and I'm pretty direct when I say it, but let's be honest. If my grandma is sitting in her urn in the closet of my bedroom or on display in my curio cabinet surrounded by dishes and knickknacks, I would hope that one would be able to see the difference in how I'm treating my grandmom compared to how the church is treating the bodies of the saints. There's a dignity of the human person that is being recognized and celebrated in the latter, the way the church does it, and is sorely lacking in the former and what I'm doing with my grandmom's remains.
Agreed. You know what's a phrase that people of my generation don't use?
What?
Curio cabinet. Nobody. I have never heard any of my friends.
You know why? Because I don't think anybody in your generation has.
No, we
a
don't
curio,
have them. We don't even know. I wouldn't even be able to identify what a curio. But my parents talk about it a lot, and
Yeah.
my parents are much older than you. I'm not putting you in their generation. But yeah, I've never been like, man, I really need a curio cabinet in that corner. Never thought that in my life.
Yes, this is true. But
so what is a curio cabinet?
Well, it's not like what is the cabinet that is used in a living room? A lot of people do
like
have
a buffet?
those. Not like the buffet. The buffet would be the flat
credenza?
top. Or maybe a credenza would be a good example.
So a curio is does a curio have, is it like a display case? Does it have glass?
Yeah.
Oh,
Why can't I remember of the name of the the cabinet that is used in dining room sets?
That's a buffet. That's like a buffet and a hutch thing.
Like a hutch, glass
okay.
hutch, where you have all your dishes
Okay.
and everything, something like
All
that.
right.
But a curio would be a much smaller. It'd be like half the size, and it really is for just kind of displaying. Well, I'm a curio,
Like Russian nesting dolls, if you have them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, curiosities,
Got
so
it.
to speak.
Okay.
Right? I think that's maybe even where the name curio comes from.
Okay.
So
Well, that's
for
good to know.
those other millennials that are listening to this,
If you didn't know how old Dennis was,
you do.
you do now. And if you didn't know how young, not that I am, how I was, my confusion should tell you something. So
But the point is that this really isn't a contradiction or hypocrisy,
it's
right?
not a contradiction. If anything, the veneration of relics is entirely coherent with the church's teaching on the dignity of the human person and the human body. Whereas the scattering, or really the discarding of ashes, or the keeping of ashes of a loved one in my home or in a locket, some other piece of jewelry, and people get real creative with it today. Now I see there's like Etsy shops where you ship your loved one's ashes and they'll make artwork with it. They'll make beach scenes where the ashes are actually the sand.
They'll
and
put
you
it
can
in the
frame
pigments
it.
of paint
And
paint.
And again, I know why people do these things. I know why they seek it out. They want to feel close to the people. But I'll never forget when you said it in an earlier episode. You are never close to your loved ones that have passed on than you are in the Mass.
Yeah.
So
in the
you want to feel
Eucharist.
close to your dead family members?
Yep.
Go
Go
to
to Mass. Come to the Eucharist. That's the beauty of what these relics are designed for. They're supposed to draw us into the mystery of our faith, into the beauty of our relationship with Christ Jesus, and help us to love him more fully. If they're not doing that, then we're either viewing it wrong, using them wrong, or we need to kind of reorient ourselves to church teaching. So that's hopefully you have a better understanding of what relics are and aren't, their purpose, how they go about being authenticated, the importance of this tradition within the church.
Yeah. It's why I love being Catholic. I love the stuff that the church offers us.
Yeah.
More stuff.
More stuff.
All right.
So I'm gonna, just comb my gray beard and go take a nap.
Go ahead.
And
Don't bump into your curio cabinet as you wander back to your dwelling. That's great.
all right.
We will see you next week.
All right. God bless.